Wake up, Twins territory, and welcome to Twins Hangouts. I'm Jeremy Nagar, joined by Seth Stows. Little special edition Monday night hangout going on after today's news. Seth, how are you doing today?
I'm doing good. I'm one of those weird guys. Obviously, as people know and we talked about, I have an 8 to 5 job. That is actually what I get paid to do as opposed to this podcasting and blogging and all that kind of stuff. So I have to be there. But when we heard the news earlier today or shortly before noon, I really wanted to listen to the press conference, especially since I knew that Ron Gardenhire would be in attendance, which I think is pretty unusual and we can talk more about later. So I actually used a couple of vacation hours today because I figured if I was at work, I'd be distracted and I would want to listen online to the press conference, and someone would call on the phone, and then I'd just be crabby at them for not, for interfering with my day. So I actually took those hours off and came home, wrote a blog quick at Twins Daily, and kind of feel like I maybe shouldn't have used the time, but of course I have to because it's kind of a thing I do. Other than that, everything's good.
You really cut out on my side there for quite some time, but everything's good. It sounds like.
Everything's good for
And you
here.
took the noble route there, taking some time off instead of just not being productive at work.
Right. Plus, the phone has to ring, and I have to answer it when it does, and I would probably just be crabby.
Um, yeah, my day was a little bit different. I had just made assigned a math assignment, and
Yeah.
then noticed that my Twitter feed had a ton of unread messages, and I was like, "Ooh, I think that must mean something happened." Because typically I don't follow a ton of people, so it doesn't build up. But when there was like 20 minutes and 100 some unread messages, I kind of figured um, the news had broke. Uh, Luckily, following math was recess, so I had a little bit of time to think about it. But yeah, it was an interesting day, and then
Well,
I didn't get to see any of the press conference. We had a football game this evening, so um, yeah, the timing. Obviously, we knew something was going to happen today. We just weren't sure what. So before we get into the Gardy thing, let's talk about some of the other stuff that's happened here recently.
yeah, I mean, when we last had this show, which was last week, I think we knew that today could potentially be a big day for Twins news. We didn't know if Gardy would be back or some of his coaching staff. Based on what they've done in previous years, we did know that stuff would happen today. Now, there ended up being a lot more than we thought. So, like Jeremy said, we're going to spend a ton of time talking about Ron Gardenhire and that situation and what it all means going forward. But there are several other topics as well that I thought it would be important for us to cover. And the first one is we learned today, I think it was WCCO that first posted it, that Tom Kelly, former Twins manager, obviously the predecessor to Ron Gardenhire, had a minor stroke on Friday, and he did return home today. And all reports are that everything's good, um, but obviously that's something not to be taken lightly. And not that we need to talk about it a whole lot, but obviously we would certainly wish the best for the former Twins manager.
Yeah, I mean, I saw that, and it was kind of too bad because it was just kind of a footnote in the rest of the day's news. But the word that it was mild um, is nice. At first, I think it just said suffered a stroke and is resting at home. Yeah, so I mean that's a scary deal, but it sounds like everything's going to happen, or or be positive is what's going to happen here with the mild stroke. You got to get that stuff treated because if you don't, you can have another one, and I know some people that's happened to, and it's not a good deal. So wish him the best in his recovery, and hopefully it goes well.
That's why, and you can't see this while you're listening to this, but I had minor stroke on Friday, but minor was in parentheses for me because I've experienced that too. Um, you know, Strokes, and obviously they're not something to mess with. So again, best wishes to Tom Kelly. Quick reminder, Jeremy and I are happy to take your questions for later in the show. If you have any mailbag questions about anything Twins related, Twins minor league related, or about Ron Gardenhire or this situation, feel free to tweet us or to, on the page you're on Twins Daily, send us a question or comment. We'll get to those later.
Seth, did you
Yep,
just say you suffered a minor stroke on Friday?
I did not. Did I?
That's what it sounded like to me. But maybe you said that Tom Kelly suffered a minor stroke on Friday.
Yeah, it would have been Tom Kelly.
I thought for sure you said, yeah, I suffered one. And I was like, wait a second, what?
Well, I think I might have. And I think what I was saying is I've experienced that where people I know have experienced strokes.
Oh,
And if that came out differently, I do apologize. It might have.
I was like, what? It just happened there. Okay.
Yeah, and I've never claimed to be the smartest person anyone will ever meet. And if you've listened to this podcast long enough, you know that already. So
You're good, though.
I'm good right now. Yeah, I
Okay.
think. All right. Late last week, Trevor Plouffe tweeted that he had gone and talked to some doctors and found out he was happy to learn that he would not have to have surgery on his fractured forearm. The Twins encouraged him to get a second opinion. This morning, he and his wife drove to Rochester to the Mayo Clinic to get that second opinion, and he actually had surgery today on his fractured forearm. All reports are that he will be ready by spring training, but obviously it was a bit of a surprise to hear that he had actually not only had the second opinion, but required the surgery. So obviously, again, best wishes to Trevor Plouffe. I think he had clearly his best overall year, offensively and defensively this year. Definitely took a step forward. Just unfortunate it had to end like it did.
Yeah, it's just so crazy. It's like dude suffers a pretty significant injury, and was it the third to last game of the year?
Right.
So, I mean, if that would have happened, in April, I mean, he would have been looking at basically the whole season. So, I mean, the timing of it, if he's going to have something like that, couldn't really be any better. And he had a good year, and I think he's put himself in a position where he was going to figure into the equation somehow over the next handful of years, which I don't know that that's where he was at the beginning of the season. So, having a good year like he did obviously upped his stock. An unfortunate injury, but didn't really cost him a lot of time. Will just cost him some, off-season time.
Right. Well, I guess if you're looking for a silver lining, you're absolutely right. But at the same time, this is something that's a break rather than, something like a, torn ligament or something. So there's a pretty defined timeline, and it's just, like you said, ideal that it happens at this time, if it's going to happen.
Right.
All right.
What else we
Ricky
got?
Nolasco had a tough year with the Twins this year. I think everyone would agree with that. That said, he ended with a very solid September when his ERA was actually under 3, and he pitched really well against the Pirates. Against the Tigers. However, he had an interesting tweet this morning that got Twins fans talking and, in fact, made it to Hardball Talk and other places as well. Ricky Nolasco had a tweet from a fan of the Los Angeles Dodgers that basically said, "Wish you were here with LA." To which Ricky Nolasco responded with, "As do I," or "So do I,"
So
with
do I.
5 exclamation points. With 5 exclamation points. So as someone like myself who uses exclamation points very often, emphatically, he's basically saying that he really wishes he was with the Dodgers. Now, you can take that 2 or 3 ways, I'm sure. Number one, who knows? Maybe he was just flirting with someone who was on Twitter. Number two, clearly he played for a team that lost 92 games versus a team that's probably one of the favorites to be a World Series contender. You can certainly understand, it'd be nice for him to be on that team. I guess I don't think we should. It certainly is interesting when you're in the public eye and something like that comes out.
Yeah, for sure. Are you still commenting, or did you cut out again?
I quit
Okay.
talking.
Um, I saw it relatively early this morning, and I actually saw Andrew Walter had retweeted it, so I retweeted that. Um, my immediate reaction was, "What the heck is he thinking?" But given that he makes his off-season home in Florida with a couple of the Marlins players, and had just tweeted how he missed those guys. Um, I think maybe coming up to Minnesota was a little. It was obviously different than he expected. He had a season much worse than he expected, and sometimes after the season, you need to get away. And I think obviously I don't know where he was when he tweeted that, but it might have been something as simple as he just wishes he was in LA where that's home for him.
Right.
So, you know, if if uh, if Joe Mauer was playing somewhere else and someone said, "Hey, I wish you were in MN," because that's where he grew up, and he said, "So do I," then maybe that's not a big deal. The timing of it is peculiar. The emphasis behind it was probably not well thought out, but maybe it could have, like you said, it could have been somebody he was flirting with, or just a fan of his or a friend of his that he just lost touch with, or whatever. So uh, I think it's a non-issue, and I think if he's going to do it on a day, he picked the exact right day to do it when it becomes another side story to the main story.
Right. And, combined with his comments after this win against Detroit the other night, Jamie Hirsch asked him after the game on the post game that they showed on Fox Sports North, is this the kind of start that really gets you ready and thinks and what you need to be ready for next year? And he just basically said, I'm not even thinking about next year. I just want to get done with this year. It sounds kind of off. I mean, it's not what you want to hear as a fan, but after a 162 game season and the tough year that he had, I mean, he's just being honest. We want guys to be more honest rather than just cliches. So when he said it, my initial reaction was, well, that's not what you really want to hear as a fan, but it's understandable. It's a long year. I get just wanting it over with, and then you'll start thinking about next year in another couple weeks or a month after you've had a just chance to get away from it. But the combination, I mean, it's not just the normal answers you expect to hear.
Right, absolutely.
So a couple of things, the Twins have made a few moves. One of them, we'll talk about the big one that affects all the coaches. But the Twins also decided not to bring back Fort Myers Miracle pitching coach Gary Lucas. A couple weeks ago, it was Bill Springman, the Twins minor league hitting coordinator, they decided not to bring back. And now it's Gary Lucas, who last year and actually since 2005 has been a pitching coach in the Twins system. Um, they decided not to bring him back, and it kind of threw me because obviously this is a guy that I've met. I met him last year in Cedar Rapids, talked to him for probably a half an hour. I talked to him this spring at spring training in Fort Myers. As we talked about on a previous podcast, I talked to him about J.O. Barrios and some of the other guys that he had seen this year, and that was around the All-Star break right before the Futures game that Barrios started. And I just look at, if you're looking for a scapegoat, that's one thing, but you look at that Fort Myers pitching staff, both starters and relievers, both the prospects, the guys like, maybe Jason Wheeler and Mason Militakis and Tyler Duffy and J.O. Barrios, these are all guys that he helped get to New Britain and be ready for that. Not only that, but then the guys that, the Matt Tomshaws and the David Hurlbutts and the Brett Lees and, the bullpens that they had with Van Steensel and Brandon Peterson. You just kind of go on and on of the guys that he worked with these last 2 years, last year in Cedar Rapids and this year in Fort Myers, and he had a lot of success stories. So for me, this one's hard to really understand.
Yeah, I think was it Friday afternoon that this news came out, and I didn't
Yeah, I
really.
think so.
I mean, it was surprising, I think, to everybody. The thing that I remember, I think we talked about it briefly last year. I thought it was weird that he was moved from Cedar Rapids to Fort Myers in the first place. And he's from, or he lives not far from actually where I live. It's about an hour to the north, in
Right.
in a town in Wisconsin. So I thought, well, if he was in Beloit, which is a commute home if he had to, or even Cedar Rapids, which would be probably about a 5-hour trip for him. I thought that just made sense. And when he got moved down to Fort Myers, it basically just flip flopped with Arteaga. It just didn't really add up to me. So I don't know if this is part of a thing that's been going on. Obviously, the production has been pretty good, as you mentioned. But I just, looking back even a year ago, I thought it was an interesting thing that he got moved, and obviously it continues to be an interesting thing now. And it's so hard because you look at, like with Mauer, he started in Fort Myers and then went down to Cedar Rapids, and it was, even though it was a lower level, it wasn't really a demotion. And that's kind of, I looked at
Right.
Lucas, even though it was up a level, I didn't really look at it as a promotion. You know what I mean? So I guess,
I
it,
didn't either.
go ahead.
I saw it a couple ways. One, I saw it as a chance for him to work with the same guys 2 years in a row, and I also think that we expected Felix Jorge, Randy Rosario, Yorman Londa, to be kind of the cornerstones in that Cedar Rapids rotation. So we thought maybe Arteaga, being from Venezuela himself, would be a good mix there. So I think we gave it a good reason in our minds. Whether or not that was it, we don't necessarily know. But I mean, I don't know. Like I said, production wise, I don't think he could have done much more. I'm probably admittedly biased because I've seen him work with the pitchers. I've seen the relationship. I've seen the passion, and obviously I've talked to the guy too, so there's something there. But at the same time, I look at the numbers and the pitchers that he's helped get to that double A level and wonder why is he the scapegoat, so to say, when pitching really was a high point in this organization this whole year, despite some injuries and such. And if there were any struggles, it was more at that upper level. So, but at the same time, if I'm being honest, I mean, aside from Kyle Gibson and now Logan Darnell, who are the pitchers in the Twins farm system, that the Twins have developed from draft or international signing through the big league level? And you know there just haven't been a lot. So maybe, like you said, this is something that's been, I guess, in the works for a while. Maybe, I don't know.
Right. Yeah, I mean, we could talk all day about it, but without having a concrete answer, I don't know how much more we can lend to the conversation.
Right. The only other note that I had before we dive into the garden hire discussion is if you want to just give the fans a quick update on where the Twins landed at the end of the year in terms of the upcoming 2015 draft.
Yeah, Saturday night the Twins stuck it to the Tigers pretty good. I mean, that must have been their 69th win, and that win tied Houston, which, because of how the draft works, if you're tied with a team at the end of the season, the tiebreaker is the previous season's record. And obviously, with Houston being a team that was coming off the first overall pick, they were going to have the tiebreaker. So going into Sunday's game, the Twins were going to have the fifth worst record in the league, tied for the fourth, obviously, but get the fifth pick, or have that fifth slot unless they lost and Houston won. Well, they lost, and so did Houston. So that made them the fifth worst team. But because of Houston not signing Brady Aiken last year, the Astros get the second and the fifth pick. The Twins will draft sixth. I was thinking this morning, though, and we can get into this more, but the Twins are going to have that extra compensation pick when they draft. So they'll have a protected first rounder and a not obviously protected second rounder, and then a compensation draft pick as well. So with this new manager coming in and having that extra pick, I almost wonder if maybe the Twins will look a little bit harder into maybe signing a guy that's offered arbitration or offered that qualifying offer because the Twins have that extra pick to play with, and I don't know, but they'll be drafting sixth, and then it depends on compensation offers and who how many compensation picks there are to determine really where they'll fit in the second round. But yeah, they'll pick sixth for sure, and that is their lowest of the last four drafts.
Yeah, by a whole pick. So they've gone second and took Buxton. They went fourth when they picked Cole Stewart, and they were fifth when they picked Nick Gordon. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So to be fair, those were three pretty high upside guys that they were able to get because of the high pick, and yet we may not see any of them in the major leagues even yet next year, which is normal because they were all high school, high ceiling guys.
Right, and there are going to be some good college arms. That's kind of what looks like a strength. A couple high school guys. Obviously, some high school arms will propel up the draft chart as the draft gets closer. But at this point, it doesn't look like there's five standout players, which is how it typically works. The Twins get the first pick of not the best crop, but a couple college pitchers, a couple high school pitchers, a couple high schoolers. Daz Cameron is a center fielder, a toolsy center fielder from Georgia, son of Mike Cameron, and then there's I think Brendan Rodgers is a shortstop from Florida that Kyler McDaniel had first on his draft chart, and then a handful of other pitchers that the Twins are going to draft their best available, whether it's an outfielder, a shortstop, or a pitcher. That's just how they roll.
Right. All right, we're at 9:20. We aren't going to go real long tonight, and we're going to start now talking about obvious big news of the day. But again, we want to remind people, please feel free to send us your tweets, or on your Twins Daily page, feel free to post a question or comment in there about GardenFire, about the Twins, about Terry Ryan, about what we discussed, or about these things we've already discussed, or about anything you want. So with that, Jeremy, go ahead.
Well, obviously, last we had heard was a public vote of confidence from Terry Ryan of the manager Ron Gardenhire, and all recent reports suggested that Gardenhire would likely be brought back. Even last night, I guess I was under the impression that the coaches that were kind of on the hot seat were Rick Anderson, Scotty Alger, and Joe Vavra, and didn't really expect Gardy to be replaced. Now, obviously, late this morning, Jerry Krasnick, I think is his name, reported that the news about Gardenhire was coming out and didn't sound real good. And Patrick Royce, I think, made the initial call on Twitter that Gardy would be let go. Then in the Twins release that they sent out, I want to say it was about 12:25. The release that they sent out said Gardy would be relieved of his duties, or let go as manager, and the rest of the coaching staff would be hired by the new manager. The current coaching staff all remains under contract to the Twins until the end of the calendar year, but I would assume that they will be given permission to go look for jobs elsewhere if they choose to. And the other thing is, I believe Mike Berardino at some point had put in an article that organizational meetings start on October 12th, and the Twins want their whole coaching and staff in place by that day.
Yeah, and it sounds like that could move quick. Now, that's less than 2 weeks away, or about 2 weeks away. So they're going to have to move quickly. They clearly have some names that they're going to consider. They aren't just going to look internally. That said, I tend to believe that the favorites have to be internal, just because that would be certainly easier to make a quick decision on. But I think there's a lot of names out there. You mentioned the coaching staff. Gardy is obviously out, effective immediately, but the coaching staff, they're all signed through December 31st, so they're kind of in, they'll use the word Terry Ryan used was they're in limbo until that date. However, he did make the comment that those guys will be given every opportunity if they're offered a major league coaching or managing job to apply and potentially get those, because the manager that the Twins pick are going to work with Ryan to determine a new uh, coaching staff. And some of the guys they have, I think they'd like back. Like you said, I mean, Brunansky would certainly be a guy I think they would want back. Steinbach and Molitor could be manager candidates. They could certainly be manager or coach candidates elsewhere too. But I think Alger's the one that's lasted so long, along with Rick Anderson, with Ron Gardenhire. Bavra's a guy who, frankly, was incredibly underrated in the Twins by fans. I mean, he is the guy that worked with Mauer and Morneau in their MVP in their great years. He's the one that was there when Kadire took off. He's been the one that really was very good as a hitting coach, even though the fact that he didn't play in the major leagues seems to have hurt him in the eyes of a lot of fans. So I think there's some guys here that will land on their feet somewhere else. There's so many angles to this discussion that it'll be interesting to see how it plays out over the next few weeks.
Well, I think the assumption is that, at least in my mind, that the manager thing is going to happen relatively quickly. And I guess I haven't looked at the playoff schedule. Does the playing games tomorrow, and then do the division series start? Do the division series start on Wednesday?
Thursday.
I would think that, I don't think it'll happen in 2 days, but I would guess that some part in the early next week, the Twins will have a manager in place. If not over the weekend.
No, yeah, and I don't know if we want to go there yet, but I came up with a list of potential managerial candidates. I want to throw a couple out there. One, when I looked at, I think, 7 exterior, outside the organization guys, one was Chip Hale, former Twin, who has been a managerial candidate seemingly the last 4 or 5 off seasons. He's I believe, the third base coach with the Oakland A's. Yep. So if they hire someone in the next 2 weeks, I mean, he technically still might not be available for that job.
Right. And I think that with the candidates they have internally and the candidates that aren't necessarily managing or coaching right now, I think that's all we're going to see. So a guy like Chip Hale, and then that Tigers, is there a Tigers coach? Who's this? Is it Lavallo?
Yeah, Torey Lavallo is one of those huge prospects that didn't make it, but he is the bench coach with the Red Sox. He's been with John Farrell the last 4 years.
So he'd be. I mean, I just saw he was a Tigers prospect. I hadn't seen that name, but I mean, is Chip Hale's the only guy you listed that's currently coaching in the playoffs?
Correct.
So, I mean, you still have the pool's pretty much wide open. I thought there was another name I thought I'd heard another name tied to potential interest, but that is still coaching in the playoffs. Was there a Cardinals?
Oh yeah, Jose Akendo.
Yeah, that guy. But I think, if Terry Ryan, who I think he was quoted today as saying he doesn't have a list yet, but he's going to start working on that tomorrow. The only way I see them waiting is if they go through a lot of interviews and he's just not blown away by anybody. But at the same time, I would be shocked if he would make this hard of a decision, as it was for him, to get rid of Gardy without having a pretty good idea who he thought the next guy was going to be. Or at least know that there's a lot of options available.
Right, and I think, there's strong candidates internally. I mean, we've named 4 or 5 of them in the last weeks when we have talked about these types of things. We've got a guy like Dave Martinez with the Rays, who's been with Joe Madden forever, and of course there's a huge contingency of Twins fans and stat head types that say anything Joe Madden does is perfect. So, of course, Dave Martinez will be a widely accepted guy. And I remember Dave Martinez as a player, and he was awesome and smart, and I think he would be a good manager. Joe McEwing's the third base coach for the White Sox, but he was one of those quick rising managers in the minor leagues who got to the big leagues really quick. Um, you know, there's other names. I mean, there's a lot of talk about Ozzie Guillen, most of that coming from K-Fan, and I think that would be crazy. Manny Acta is a guy like Guillen who is from the Caribbean. Acta, I believe, is from the Dominican. Guillen's from Venezuela. That's something I think that people think is important to the next coach, whether it's actually being from a Caribbean country or at least being able to be bilingual, that type of thing. One that I think we should probably downplay right away is Mike Redmond. He did sign a extension with the Marlins through 2017, so I don't think he's a legit option. I don't think that Terry Ryan necessarily knows who he's going to pick, but I would agree with you in saying that I think he knows who he wants to talk to and who he wants to bring in, and he'd like to get kind of a second opinion or a first-hand feel for.
Right. Did you see, was it Doogie today that reported that something about Molitor's interest in the job, not even sure if he would accept if he was offered the job? Did you see that?
I saw one from Doogie that said the Twins, or that Molitor does have several with the Twins that do like him, and that he might be interested in the job. So I heard kind of the opposite, I guess. But
I also heard, and this was just talking to someone, and I don't know where he had heard it, but he said that he didn't believe there was any chance that Molitor gets this job because the Twins are disappointed in the amount of time that he put into it this year. I don't know if that's true or not, but I thought that was interesting.
It's interesting for sure, because I think a lot of people see him as the favorite.
Right. And part of me really thought, okay, so they offer this, Terry Ryan essentially gives him this extra job that they could add last year, gives it to him, and then they're just going to, cut bait on him the following year. I mean, if they want to make a fresh start and they want to get rid of him like that, that's one thing. But to bring a guy in that's really helped out forever and then have him just not be a part of it anymore, that's why I kind of put him into this. And someone asked me on Twitter, does that mean that Molitor and Steinbach aren't going to be considered for the managerial position, or I don't know if it was managerial or just coaching positions? And it's like, well, I think they'll both be considered. I just don't know that either of them would come back if it wasn't with the title of manager. You know what I mean?
I think I could see them being a package deal though. I could see one of them being manager and the other being bench coach. I could see that. I guess right now my thought is that Terry Steinbach will either be the manager of the Diamondbacks or the Twins at this point.
Yep, I would agree with that. But as of yesterday, the Diamondbacks hadn't contacted Terry Ryan for permission to speak to him. But maybe they are still doing their work. With La Russa and Stewart there, it's almost like if you have a guy that might be a possibility, you almost have to connect him to that job, right?
Right. And I mean, others have said that Joe McEwing's an obvious choice for the Arizona job because of the role he played for La Russa on some of those St. Louis teams that won World Series. He was the guy that played every single position. He was Super Joe, and he's got this great record of leadership and willingness to be a part of the team and that type of stuff that certainly fits into what an ideal managerial candidate would be. So I mean, there's ties in baseball that you almost forget about. La Russa definitely has that tie with McEwing, and obviously Jose Oquendo with the Cardinals has been there. I mean, he was a Cardinals player in the '87 World Series. I mean, he's been around the Cardinals forever. It'd be weird to see him in a non-red uniform, but at the same time, he makes a ton of sense in Arizona. So it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out. I'm not sure what's going to happen. And we've talked a lot about the internal candidates. We've talked about Steinbach and Molitor here tonight, but I know you and I both have been, if not proponents of, at least guys who would be in favor of guys like Doug Minkiewicz, Jake Maurer, and Gene Glynn, all managers this year in the minor league system, at least getting an opportunity to either interview or maybe be part of a future coaching staff.
Right. I would take any of those three guys on staff. I think Mauer's likelihood of being the manager is pretty close to zero because that with Joe on the team, I just don't see that happening. Um, I could see him filling the role like first base coach, um, but I would put Minkiewicz up in that same tier with Molitor and Steinbach. Personally, maybe it's more because I want to see him get that job. I exchanged texts with one person that's in the organization, and he didn't really want to comment about anything. But my only thing was, and I'd had a conversation with him before, and said I'd like to see Minkiewicz get the job, and he wasn't completely on board with it. But when I sent him a text today and said, "Are you surprised?" His whole response was, "I know you aren't." So I think it really came as a shock to a lot of people in the organization, except for probably the people that knew exactly what was going to happen, and that was the president, the owner, and the GM. But I don't think anybody really saw it happen. But I do think that Minkiewicz will get a fair shake. Maybe not as the manager. I think given the fact that he's been a manager for, is it only 2 years or 3 years?
2
Um,
years.
2 years, 2 years managerial experience. I don't know that the Twins would do that. Now, if Glenn gets the job and they move Minkiewicz up, I would have no issues with that. That he takes on another role in the minor leagues. If he becomes a bench coach or a third base coach, I wouldn't have any issues with that. But at the same time, if I can hire a guy from outside of the organization like Martinez and keep Glenn, Minkiewicz, and Maurer in the minor leagues, I'd feel pretty good about that too. So as long as those minor league guys are, going to stay, if they don't get the job, I won't be as disappointed. If Steinbach were to not get it and leave, was his first year, right? Or second year
Steinbach's like his third year.
as the bench coach?
Yeah, at least second.
I thought he wasn't Scotty Elger the bench coach and then got moved. I think 2 years, right? With that whole shuffle, Bernansky came in, Steinbach came in.
Yep.
It, I guess they all have relatively the same amount of coaching experience, and if Steinbach gets that job in Arizona, great. Uh, there's so many moving parts that if I was Terry Ryan, I would really look outside first, knowing that I have candidates in the minor leagues if that's what it came to. But look outside first and see what kind of interest you get, and it's going to be a job that people look at as a positive job because you have the best farm system in baseball, and you have room on your payroll to add some stuff. Uh, I don't know how much. I think they said that they don't see it decreasing. It'll be about the same. But there's money to spend there for sure, and I think this is obviously just the first domino of what could amount to be a number of dominoes that falls between now and really Thanksgiving.
Certainly. I just, as far as Minkiewicz goes and is only having 2 years of managerial experience, I mean, does anyone question Doug Minkiewicz knows the game of baseball and how to manage it? I mean, it's like asking, well, Brad Ausmus never managed a single game in his life, and Detroit gave him the job and he got to the playoffs. I mean, and that's not to say he's a good, bad, or indifferent manager. I don't think, I mean, obviously experience is a good thing, but I don't think lack of experience would be the reason that Minkiewicz wouldn't get the job or shouldn't get the job. Maybe it will be. Maybe the Twins are going to insist on someone who has managerial experience, maybe even big league managerial experience. I don't think that will be a requirement. Um, but I hope that's not the reason they wouldn't consider him. But how about this? Here's another side to this question is, Ron Gardenhire and his coaching staff all kind of are taking the fall right now. And during the press conference, over and over again, Terry Ryan and Ron Gardenhire both said the reason that this day has happened is because of all of the losses over all of these years. At the same time, Terry Ryan has also said, and Gardy didn't use it, but Terry Ryan also said that the lack of talent is what caused those losses for the most part, and yet now he's retained his job. And tonight, I know that Jim Pohlad and Dave St. Peter, who were both unable to be at the press conference but did their own tonight with the media, basically said that the decision was Terry Ryan's to make, and that they're supporting whatever he decides and they want him back. Should Terry Ryan take a little bit more responsibility? Personally, I think he's taken the responsibility, and he's not resigned, and he's not going to retire himself. What do you think about Ryan retaining his job to this point?
Well, I think that whole situation's interesting in the fact that he stepped down, named a replacement, and that's really when the ball started to roll the wrong direction. The first year Target Field, Bill Smith made some trades, really made an effort for the Twins to compete. And then the next year, which would have been 2011, everything kind of went south in a hurry. Bill Smith, I believe, was he 2011 and 2012 before Terry Ryan took back over 2013, or was he just 1 year? It had to have been 2 years.
Yeah, it was at least a couple of years.
So, some of the moves that Bill Smith made, I guess you could look at it and say that set the franchise back. That kind of gives Terry Ryan, it gives Terry Ryan a little bit of a break in that he wasn't necessarily the one that navigated it south, but he left. And some people might say that Terry Ryan left because he knew that it was going to turn south. Some may also argue that he hired, or he helped select the guy that helped it turn south, that he should take some responsibility. But I think in the ownership's eyes and in Dave St. Peter's eyes is that Terry Ryan wasn't around for wasn't responsible for the beginning of the collapse. Went through a health thing this last offseason and into the early this year that he wasn't around in spring training. So how easy is it to put it on a guy that hasn't been the guy, hasn't been a huge part of it. He was obviously, well, you know what? Did he negotiate the Nolasco deal? Wasn't that a deal that he just kind of, signed off on it the day of, but didn't do the negotiating?
I don't recall that. I don't know.
I seem to think that happened. So, I'm willing to cut him a little bit of slack, but if I was running the ship, it would have been like, hey, you're just as much responsible, probably more responsible than he is. And I think that does raise the question of if he has too much power. But if ownership trusts a GM, what are you really gonna? I mean, what can you do? That's what the guy's in the position for. Now, if Gardy's job offer becomes, special assistant to the general manager, that's just going to be weird. And that's obviously speculation. I don't know what kind of job. Do you think that would be weird or not weird?
Whatever job they're going to give Gardy is going to be pretty much in name. I mean, Tom Kelly's special assistant to the GM. He's roving minor league reporter. I mean, we'll see how this plays out, but they're not going to have Gardenhire making baseball decisions. They'll have him coaching in the minors, the roving type of thing, or hanging out at instructional league a little bit, or doing some appearances. And I mean, that's down the line. I really think Gardy may take a year off, but he's going to get another managerial position within the next year or two. And who knows, he may be there for 10 years. So, I mean,
Right.
but I think even then, the job offer will be open. He's going to be a Twins Hall of Famer. I mean, it's going to happen.
Right. Yeah. I guess there's just like I said earlier, there's so many moving parts and so many dominoes that have to fall, and uh, you know, I I would guess we're going to start hearing names relatively soon because you got to get when there's three job openings, right? Or is there four right now? Three now that Hinch is hired, right?
Right.
You got
I don't know.
to, yeah. I'm pretty sure. Um, well, who just got fired? Gibson. I just looked today.
Yeah.
Texas, Arizona, and now Minnesota. So three jobs. You're going to want to get these guys in before they go somewhere else for an interview, or at least get them in before they accept a job, right?
Certainly.
So I would assume, I would guess we'll start. Maybe we won't hear the names, but there'll be people trickling into to the target field, you know, within the next couple days.
Oh, no question. Absolutely. What do you think about this? Now, obviously, losses was a big part of it. What are your thoughts on this being primarily a PR move? Meaning, they don't have the All Star game this year, and even with the All Star game, ticket sales were down. I had a Twitter conversation with a couple of people last week where they were saying, they'd heard projections that the Twins would be down from 20,000 to 17,000 season ticket holders. I projected that would be closer to 12,000, like an 8,000 drop. Do you think this decision to fire Ron Gardenhire has anything to do with season ticket sales?
Uh, I don't think it's a big part. I do think that it's obviously a part. Um, the hard part for me, the thing that I struggle with is if Gardy was going to, or if the Twins were going to fire Gardy, why wasn't he fired after the first year when there could make when he went from division champs to last place? Um, and then after that, I was like, well, if they just wanted to keep him around, whatever the case was, they really needed to do something. Last year, when he didn't get fired, when he signed his extension, there was a lot of people that were not real happy, and being one of the first and only guys to go three straight 90 loss seasons and not lose his job, and now he went to fourth. I mean, you don't want the fans to revolt, and the All Star game, like you said, it's not keeping people around. So I think there was obviously, maybe that played a part in it. Maybe but I don't think Terry Ryan went over to the ticket sales and said, "How are season tickets?" And they're like, "Oh, Terry, they're way down." And he's like, "That's it, we're firing Gardy."
Right.
But I think that probably played a role, um, but not a huge role. What do you think?
I think, like I said, I projected close to 8,000 would not renew their season tickets. Maybe maybe announcing Gardy is not the manager, and by the time that people will have to renew, they'll have a new manager. Maybe it'll only be 7,500. I just don't think it has a big effect. Now, if they went out and signed some big name pitcher, if they signed Max Scherzer, maybe now you're talking about only 4,000 down instead of 8,000. I don't know that there's a managerial candidate out there, with the possible exception of Ozzie Guillen, that would really get Twins fans excited. I think a lot of people just expect it to be Paul Molitor, but he's already there.
Right,
So I don't think that would do much for season tickets. If you got Ozzie Guillen, maybe people would just go for crazy, just
right.
to see what crazy thing he would do or say next.
I don't know that I would hire Ozzie Guillen as the manager, but I would love to have that guy on staff.
Be entertaining.
Yeah, and I think his mentality would fit really well with Oswaldo Arcia, eventually with Miguel Sano, Kenny Vargas. I think there's just I think it would be a benefit to have him, even if he wasn't the manager. I don't know if he would take a job like that, but at the same time, I think a lot of people think it's a joke. It should be a joke, and um, but he was a good manager. He's a good baseball mind, and I'd be willing to kick the tires on that just
My
to see if
initial
he's
thought
interested.
was my initial thought was it would be crazy to even consider him. I think they could find a Spanish-speaking option that wouldn't be quite as controversial. I mean, he said some really dumb things
Oh yeah,
outside of the realm of baseball. But the more I started thinking about it, I mean, he has won and he's been successful. I don't know that I'd want to see him as a manager, but if you teamed him with a Terry Steinbach or a Paul Molitor, I think he might consider it. I mean, these are his contemporaries, guys that he played against and presumably has a ton of respect for. He might consider that, and if in that scenario you've kind of got the calm of Paul Molitor with the crazy of Ozzie Guillen, that may play well both in the clubhouse and on the field.
see, and that it's just one of many options that could happen. Now, I'm just going to throw this out there because I mentioned it on Twitter. Bert Blyleven always says he wants to be a pitching coach. Do you think there's any chance that he ends up the
No,
pitching coach?
no.
I, Part of me just hopes that he's the pitching coach, so I don't have to listen to him on the TV anymore.
That's a valid point. But from a what he might do to a pitching staff, I don't know.
Yeah, that could be awesome.
I don't know. I mean, honestly, do you think Ozzie Guillen's an actual candidate that they
Uh,
would consider going to? I don't think they would actually go and talk to him or interview him or anything.
yeah,
Whether they should or not is a different question, but I don't know that they actually would.
I don't think they will. I would like it if they did, but yeah, I guess I don't look at that as a likelihood. It's more for me a pipe dream. How about some of these other names? These are not names that you mentioned. Um, I look at the guys that like coached in the WBC. Um, Luis Sojo was he the manager for like Venezuela?
Yep.
And he currently, I think he's a coach in the Yankees um, farm system. Looks like he's the third base coach. It says he's the third base coach for the AAA affiliate. I guess I didn't know that AAA affiliates had third base coaches. But like you said, there's a lot of names that Tony Pena. His name used to come up in manager discussions, or is that just me not remembering correctly?
No, I think it used to, and then he got the job in Kansas City and got himself in a lot of trouble, and really I don't think he's been a candidate since then. Not that he shouldn't be, but I don't think he has been for a while.
Yeah, guess I forgot about the Kansas City. I don't know. There's so many names, and I think that the best thing that we can do though is look at this and say it doesn't sound like the Twins are just going to immediately hire someone internally.
Right.
And
I
I
think
think
to
that
me
that
as
was the feeling
fans,
people had.
I think the prudent thing for us to do as fans and for those listening is this. Sit down. I mean, take 5 minutes, and I mean, obviously, it depends how much time you have and how cool you are. But take 5 minutes and just say, okay, what are the things if I were the GM or the player personnel director or the owner? What are the things that I would be looking for in a manager? Because I think Ron Gardenhire is a very good manager, and I think with good talent, he can be a very good manager. And we've seen that. But what are the traits that you would be looking for in a candidate? And I guess here's just some that I wrote down, and you can add to it if you want, Jeremy. But or speak to any of these, number one, and these are in no particular order, is the ability to speak Spanish is ideal, but certainly not a game breaker, because you can have a couple of guys that are either bilingual or Spanish speaking on the coaching staff. To me, it doesn't have to be the manager, but I do think that at least a couple of guys on the coaching staff should be bilingual.
I would 100% agree with that. If it's not the manager, it needs to be the bench coach. It can't be the bullpen guy.
Right.
But two of the guys that are in the dugout, whether that's a bench coach and a position coach, like a first or third base guy, or the bench coach and the extra coach. But two of the guys have to be of Spanish speaking or have the ability to at least speak Spanish.
Right. Secondly, I do think that the ability to understand and take the time to understand the analytics and the advanced stats is important. I'm definitely not one who thinks that you need to go by the book all the time. I think going off of hunches is very important based on things that we will never see as fans. What's going on in the clubhouse, what's going on with that person's family, who is just having tremendous appearances in team lifting or batting practice or that type of stuff. So I think people have to go on hunches, but at the same time, I think that person should be well aware and understand the advanced stats. And that doesn't mean this guy's 3 for 5 against pitcher X, which means he automatically starts. I mean, I think it's, using platoons where appropriate and, even shifting, which I think is vastly overrated. Just being willing to understand that those things are important, even if you don't use them in every single game. I think it's important to understand them.
Right, and I think that's kind of the way of the world, of the baseball world. And I think that you need to have at least a couple guys that are willing to do that. But again, I don't necessarily think. Well, you know what? The manager probably should do that, because if he doesn't, it could be an issue. So I would put that less important as Spanish speaking, but probably something that everyone apply for a job or interested or interview for a job is going to have that, at least say that's how they're going to manage.
Right, and again, like you said, that's not just the manager, but certainly the bench coach, maybe the pitching coach, hitting coach. Use not just the video, but all of that. Then I've got 4 more here, just as kind of a starting point, and that's all I've got. People can add more to this, but number 1, handling of starting pitchers, and 2, handling of relief pitchers. The manager has to have a pretty good idea of what they want to do in that scenario. How do you feel about 100 pitches? How do you feel about, which innings bullpen guys can use, or how often you're going to make pitching changes? How often do you feel comfortable using a pitcher? I mean, there's a lot of that in-game types of things that it's nice to not know from game to game necessarily this is how it's always going to happen, but to have a pretty good idea of this is what I'd like to do with these scenarios.
Right.
The second part of that is, and I think this one is really important for the Twins and their decision making. Number 1 is, how do you handle young players? And the part B of that is, how do you handle veterans? You're going to need someone who's going to be able to help out and to be there, or to be whatever you're looking for the Danny Santanas, the Kenny Vargas, Miguel Sano, Byron Buxton, J.O. Barrios, Alex Meyer, Trevor May, all of those young guys that we think is going to be the next core. Those are the guys you need to know how they're going to kind of handle and how they feel about having young guys, because they're all going to struggle. Do you bench them for a couple of games and have them work extra and just watch, or do you just keep playing them through 0 for 20s? I mean, and what are you telling them, and how do you approach that, or when do you send them to AAA, which obviously is hand in hand with the hitting coach, with the pitching coach, and with the GM. I mean, I'm not saying these are all independent thing that only that player has. The other half of that is, how do you handle veterans? I mean, you're going to have guys like Ricky Nolasco and Phil Hughes and Glenn Perkins and obviously the big one being Joe Mauer. And how do you handle them when they need a day off, or the media's beating them up, or fans are beating them up, or they I mean, obviously, I don't believe that. My personal opinion is you don't treat everyone equal. I think veterans deserve and have earned their ability to be treated a little bit differently. But you also have to be able to go to those veterans and say, hey, those younger guys are looking toward you, and I need you to do this. And to be able to influence the veterans, I think, is pretty important as well. So for me, those are 6 things that I would be looking for if I was going through the interview process.
Yeah, and I think that's probably a pretty solid outline of what everybody's looking for if they're hiring a manager.
And I would hope
You
so.
know?
I would hope so.
Yeah.
But I think it's a good exercise for all of us. And then to realize, I put together on Twins Daily that list of 12 candidates. We've talked about a couple of more, and in the comment section, we've seen a couple more. The reality is we don't know how any of these people would act or respond to any of those questions, and we don't know how they would do in the real life once they got hired. So, I mean, we can make a whole bunch about whoever they do pick, whether it's Molitor, Steinbach, Minkiewicz, or if it's Joe McEwing or Manny Acta or Ozzie Guillen. We just don't know how it's going to go. So we're going to talk about it probably the next few weeks on the Twins Hangouts, and you're going to hear a lot about it, a lot of speculation, and then once they hire someone, a lot of people saying this is good or this is bad. But the reality is, until we see them in action for a couple of years, that's when we'll find out.
Right. You had listed the likelihood of your top 5 in order of likelihood, and you put Steinbach, Minkiewicz, Molitor, Chip Hale, and Gene Glenn. You did that this afternoon. Is that what it would still be for you right now?
I think for right now it would be. I probably would push Glenn back and maybe some other outside guy. Some of the names we've mentioned. Maybe Guillen is actually higher on that list. Maybe it's someone else, but that would be the only change I would have.
Yeah, I guess at this point right now, I would say I don't know exactly what order, but the three internal candidates, Steinbach, Molitor, and Minkiewicz. Glenn for me would be a dark horse. Um, I guess I would put him lower than the other 3. Martinez, I think has got to be mentioned because he's been a name that is always connected to these jobs and never seems to get it. In fact, the last thing I saw before I saw the AJ Hinch hire was that Dave Martinez was no longer in the running.
Right.
Makes me think that he must have finished number 2 there.
Most
And
likely. He's finished number 2 in a lot of places, I think.
yeah, and it's like at some point he's going to get a job and he's going to do just fine.
Right.
And I don't. I think the thing for me that has me leaning that way as a preference is that there's a lot of people in Tampa Bay that seem to be, trendsetters. And one would think that if the Twins were to hire a guy from Tampa Bay in Dave Martinez, that Dave Martinez is probably going to bring over some pretty smart people to work with him. And I think that for me is something that I would like to see. If it's a mix of guys from Tampa Bay, as well as the potential to still have like a Bernansky, that type of deal, I would be totally okay with that. But at the same time, we have no idea, how many guys they'll interview and who they'll be and how many rounds of interviews there will be. But I have a feeling that Terry Ryan has got a pretty good list started already, even though he says he doesn't, and that list will be gone over quite frequently and extensively.
Right. We've talked a lot about the future, but I think it's important if we just take a few minutes and just, Ron Gardenhire was the manager for the Twins for 13 years. And I know the Twins have had a long history, but in my mind, there's Tom Kelly and then there's Ron Gardenhire in terms of managerial prowess, so to speak. I mean, not just longevity, but, really being pretty good. he was the 2010 Manager of the Year, but he had been runner-up in 2003, 2004, 2006, 2008, 2009. And generally, that Manager of the Year goes to a manager from a team that people don't expect a lot from, but somehow they come up and they either win the division or certainly compete or have a good record and things like that. I mean, he had 1,068 wins and 1,039 losses, but I figured it out. That's 50.7% winning percentage. Before these last 4 years, his winning percentage was 55%. He was 803 and 656. In those 4 years, his winning percentage was just shy of 41%. So obviously, I think it was time. I think that just as they said in the press conference, a new voice, and even GardenFire said that. I mean, we've talked about this before, and I like GardenFire. I think he's a good manager. But over this year, I think we've all, or at least I have, and I think you have, agreed that I think change just needed to happen.
Right.
And I just think, you win 90 games 5 times. You over 500 8 out of 13 years, or actually 8 out of those first 9. And you have 6 division titles in 9 years. I don't care if it's the Central Division. You can only play the teams that are on your schedule. So I think it's being forgotten because of the 4 bad years. But this is a guy who did a lot for the organization on and off the field. He's been a great ambassador for the organization, and my sense is he will continue to be. And it'd be unfortunate if people forgot that in light of the last 4 years.
I would agree with you 100%. And I think, if Gardy wants to manage again, he'll manage again. There's not a lot of rumblings out of Texas, and I don't even know who makes a call there and the connections that they have. But there's going to be a handful of jobs that open up next off season, and if he wants a job, I would guess personally if Gardy decides that he doesn't want to manage for a year, that we will see him on the set at MLB Network or ESPN Radio or ESPN Baseball, because I think he, I think that's might be where he goes next for a year or two if he wants to take some time off. But I think he would be pretty good as a guy that just talks about baseball.
That's a great point. It's one I hadn't thought of yet. But I think his charisma and his personality, along with his baseball knowledge, would be perfect in that role. I mean, they've had a lot of good, but they've also had a lot of really bad analysts on some of these games, both in the booth and in, the studio. And I really think he would do very well at it because he's got the self-deprecating humor. He's obviously a really smart baseball guy, and like I said, he's got a lot of charisma that I think he would do that well. Maybe he'll be one of those guys that says he's going to go back to managing, but he ends up enjoying doing that, and that becomes what he does.
He'll be the next John Gruden.
Yeah, he could be. Yeah, I mean, that's a perfect example. And I don't know. Obviously, we're just throwing this out there, but I think he'd be good in that role.
Yeah, maybe the Twins could get him in the booth. That'd be all right with me.
I'd be good at that.
Let's see if we can make that happen. Talk to your people.
Okay, I don't really have any people, but that's
not true. You got all sorts of people. All right, is there more we want to touch on, or are we feeling good about this? You think it's gonna be an internal guy. I'm leaning the external way right now. Obviously subject to change, but I don't think we're gonna have a lot of time to change our mind because my guess is that 1 week from right now, the coaching staff will be entirely, well, maybe not completely in place, but almost entirely in place by next Monday night.
I'd say it'll be 2 weeks.
Okay.
At least. I think next week maybe we focus a little bit more on the rest of the prospect list as we started talking about it last week. That'll be about done, and obviously we're going to have probably much more information to discuss when we go back to our regularly scheduled time, which I think is going to be Tuesday nights, right?
Right. So we're not gonna do
unless anything comes up in between.
Right. I don't think they won't hire anybody or make any trades tomorrow. So I don't think we'll do a show tomorrow, but we'll plan on Next Tuesday night, which is October, what will that be? October 6th? October 7th. We're going October
I don't
7th.
know.
Yep, October 7th is next Tuesday. Um, unless something happens before then. If you have we did have some questions, but um, Lightfoot asked if we can name any minority employees within the system who actually coach at any level in the twin system. They have some guys in, like I can pull that up quick.
That reminds me, speaking of the GCL roster, Aaron Wasserman was a pitching coach for the GCL team. He also will not be brought back. And again, I don't know enough about him or his coaching style or anything to know if that's good or not, but another guy who will not be back in the organization.
Was that something new or?
It came out in the same Lavelle Neal article where it mentioned Gary Lucas. Or no, maybe
Yeah,
that was a
so
Mike Gardy, I bet.
so right now Rochester's coaching staff is Gene Glenn, Tim Doherty, and Marty Mason. Chattanooga's is Jeff Smith, Chad Allen, and Stu Clyburn. Fort Myers is just Doug Minkiewicz and Jim Dwyer. Cedar Rapids is Maurer, Watkins, and Arteaga, so Arteaga would be a minority guy. Um, Ray Smith and Elizabethton with Henry Bonilla, who I would assume is a minority. GCL is Ramon Borrego, Ricardo Ingram, Rudy Hernandez, Aaron Wasserman, who Seth says is no longer there, and Luis Ramirez. So they have many a Spanish-speaking coach there. And then, the other guys that they have the minor leagues is Lapel Rasmussen, is it Perluzzo?
Perlazzo.
And then Tom Kelly and Tony Oliva. So, yeah, I mean, there's not a lot. And then, obviously, Bobby Cuellar, who was, because his name is Cuellar, you assume he's Spanish-speaking, but I think he's just, he's a Texan. Yeah, and then he asked if we feel diversity is important. I think we believe that it is.
So what's
Yes,
important?
if it's important to have someone, do you guys feel that diversity is an important aspect moving forward to any new regime? Not necessarily
Absolutely.
but as manager, but within the coaching ranks. And then Des
Correct.
Tobin says that he would love to see Doug Minkiewicz. How likely is he that he becomes manager? If I had to put a percentage on Minkiewicz, I would put it at about 15%.
Yeah, that's a pretty good number because I'd probably put, based on what I showed up above, I'd probably put, I don't know, Steinbach at 25, Minkiewicz at 20, Molitor at 20. And after that, you're looking at another 35% of could be's. Maybe a
Right.
little higher on those top three.
Yeah, I would say I would put one of those three at about 60% and somebody else at about 40. And I don't know how to divide up that if I said 25, 20, 15 and then had 40% to divide up, I think Dave Martinez gets a pretty good chunk of that. Maybe 20%, and then 20% is somebody else that I don't even know about outside the organization. Joe McEwing that doesn't excite me at all. Of all the names, that one is the one that does the least amount for me.
Yep, of course, the tie-in there is he managed in the Arizona Fall League with Brian Dozier and Aaron Hicks, and he was the manager for 2 years in the Chicago White Sox system with Eduardo Escobar. So, I mean, there's ties, but those ties aren't going to be the decision maker.
Right. And obviously, if I was going from a purely excitement standpoint, let's bring the piranhas back, baby. Let's go with Ozzy. So that's where I'm at. But we've been rolling here for about 75 minutes, which is plenty for you to listen to. This will be uploaded onto iTunes probably within the hour. So thanks for listening to that. If you want to download any old episodes, the iTunes is available. There'll be links on Twins Daily for those. And Seth, is there anything else you want to throw in there before we sign off?
No, I think we're good. I do encourage people to go to Twins Daily. Lots of those events we talked about, and the comments are really filling up. So there's some really good discussion. Sign up and kind of participate in that. Brandon Warren did do a podcast tonight, about a 15-minute. Check that out, and check out his article on the rise and fall of the Twins at brandonwarren.com. And I think real quickly, we don't talk about it a lot, but the No Juice podcast was really terrific. In the last week, they went to Line Drive Sports, where former Twins minor leaguer Jamie Ogden owns and operates, and they've got the 100-mile-per-hour Killebrew Challenge there. Parker Hageman and Dan Anderson did a couple of hilarious videos of them. One attempt of Dan attempting to catch and frame a 90 or 100-mile-per-hour fastball, and then a couple of videos of them trying to hit the 100-mile-per-hour fastball. So that was entertaining. But also just be sure to listen to that one particularly because they interviewed Jamie Ogden, and I've talked to Jamie a lot. He's a tremendous person. And he's done a lot after his career for youth and those types of programs. But he tells some good stories about Derek Jeter and some of his relationships with David Ortiz and Torrey Hunter and some of those other Twins that we kind of grew to love in the 90s, or I'm sorry, in the 2000s. So, not that we want to tell you to go listen to other podcasts, but last week's No Juice podcast is probably worthwhile.
For sure. With that, I think we're going to sign off, and we'll be back next Tuesday night, and we'll be talking probably a little bit more about this as well, some other things going on within the system. So thanks for joining us tonight, and we will see you next Tuesday night. Thanks for hanging out.